In 1998, the character of Greg Heffley was created. In 2007, the massively popular book series Diary of a Wimpy Kid began. There is a 9-year gap between these two events. So what happened in between? This is what happened.
Greg's from New Jersey?
Hey everyone, Midits here. In 2004, an online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid was released and updated from 2004 to 2005. This epic spans over 1,200 pages and heavily inspires the plots and moments from the first 8 books of the Wimpy Kid franchise. It's also quite a bit, let's just say, different compared to the books most readers know. This is a long book, so let's get straight into this. The book starts very similarly to the first book, with Greg starting his journal and explaining why he has it. But what I find so interesting is seeing brief moments where events from other books happen, since in the officially released books, there's a gap of months or years between these events. But in this version, they all happen together. Also, one small thing I find cool about this version is that the full dates are put on top. For example, instead of Wednesday, it's Wednesday, September 8th. This also concretely makes the book take place from 2004 to 2005. Now, I'm not going to do a full plot summary because most of this is stuff you would probably already know, and once again, this is insanely long. So I'm just going to be talking about really cool details and changes I notice. There's one moment where Greg and Rowley play in the woods, and some 8th graders call them nerds. This moment is actually reused in Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid, and I do believe that there are more moments later on that do reappear in Awesome Friendly Kid. Despite my issues with that book, it is nice seeing some moments from this book made it into there. Also, Greg and Rowley are canonically both 12 years old and in the 7th grade. While this book has elements of the first 8 books in Awesome Friendly Kid, it mainly contains the plots of the first 3 books. Greg is in a new year middle school and starts to have issues with Rowley. Greg and Roderick are constantly at each other's throats, and Frink is trying to get Greg to man up. It kind of reminds me of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid play, which puts the plots of the first 2 books into one school year, and I'm pretty sure the Disney movies take place across one school year also. This book captures the feeling of a diary perfectly, with each of these stories happening at the same time. Honestly, the more you read through this book, the more you kind of start to forget which official book each of these moments later went into. It almost feels like this was the way they should be read because, first, this was the original way they were written, but second, a lot of timeline inconsistencies in the official books suddenly make a ton more sense. In Roderick Rules, how come Greg mentioned stealing from Susan's gingerbread house last Christmas if we never saw that in the first book? It's because that originally was supposed to happen in a time before he had a diary. Also, I'll mention this, there's a minor change in that Susan's name is Anne in this version. I obviously still think that the official releases are great, but this book so far is a really intriguing read. I noticed one plot point that kind of appears in the books but clearly changed. There is a bully who lives in the woods named Herbie Raymer, and Greg and Riley lose a rocket that goes near the woods. When Greg tells his dad about this, Frank tells a story about a bully he dealt with by having himself and his friends tell the bully to their principal. This second part reminds me of the story Frank told Greg in Cabin Fever after Greg told him about Nasty Pants, and the actual bully kind of reminds me of the Mingo kids who originated in Hard Luck. So this is a perfect example of just how much came from this book, even if it's not identical. One of the stories from the Wimpy Kid Do-It-Yourself book actually appears here, with the story being Jerome the man with incredibly red lips. In fact, it's the exact same jokes from the Do-It-Yourself book. So, as I've been reading this, there are even more ties throughout the whole franchise than I initially realized. If you want to get an idea of how long this book is, the story starts on September 7th, and it begins at page 2, and we just made it to October 1st.
136 pages in.
Colin is mentioned as being one of Greg's friends, and if you don't remember, he's who Rowley started to hang out with after ditching Greg in the first book. He appears a few times in the book, and it's neat seeing Greg have literally any other friends besides Rowley. He isn't so pathetic that he only has one friend in his entire life that he treats poorly. He feels more so just like your average middle schooler. Another change is that Manny is 5 years old, and I remember seeing something online that showed this change kind of bled into the first Wimpy Kid book. During the play in the first book, when Manny calls Greg Bubby, Greg freaks out because he's kept that nickname hidden for 5 years. He's kept that nickname hidden for 5 years? But in Roger Rules, Manny's explicitly stated as being only 3. There are quite a few goofs and errors in the books, just like with anything else, but there is a proper explanation for it since Manny was originally 5. Holly Hills both does and does not appear in this book, as she is instead called Piper Matthews. She also does not attend Greg's school, and here's a story beat that does not appear in the entire Wimpy Kid franchise at all, that being Ben Fielders. He was Greg's former best friend before moving away, and he is basically considered the main antagonist of the book, even if there isn't as much of a structured story in comparison to the official books. One thing often brought up about this book is how it's a bit more mature than the release books, but it's not anything too crazy. It really just captures a more realistic middle school experience. Okay, I just want to talk about this joke real quick. In the Wimpy Could Do It Yourself book, there's this thing where there was a card made for someone where the first half is really thoughtful, and then the second half, you can just tell Greg clearly wrote it. In the online version, Greg makes Christmas cards for people in his class, and in one, he wishes his classmate the best for the holidays. But on the back it says, "Oh yeah, isn't your dad being investigated for tax evasion?" And it shows a picture of the kid's dad actively being arrested. I love that the series is still funny to me, and it's absolutely unhinged. As you've seen, there have been a lot of slight detail changes. For example, instead of Greg living at 12 Surrey Street, he lives at 12 Prestwick Drive. Greg's swim practice isn't only during the summer, also Rowley is a part of it. One thing I did not expect when going into this book was Sweetie being in here, because I heard that the book contained the plot of the first 3 books with only minor aspects from later books. And Sweetie is a pretty big part of the 4th book. But here he isn't really that big. Seriously, look at how tiny this dude is. One different thing I like is the reason why Greg isn't sent to the school Bishop Garrigan. Frank is ready to take Greg when they run into Bill, and when Bill notices what Frank's holding, he says that he went to that school. So Frank immediately decides not to take Greg there. Something else I began to notice while reading is that, to me at least, the artwork gradually looks a bit more refined. It makes sense since this book was released from 2004 to 2005, and it's really awesome seeing the characters slowly morphing a bit more and more into the versions people know today. Here's another moment that was reused in Awesome Friendly Kid. In that book, Greg chases Rowley but loses his balance on the verge of falling into a puddle. Rowley tries to help him, but he accidentally dumps Greg into the puddle. Greg is then super upset and waits outside Rowley's house to confront him. In the online version, though, Kenny Keith, who's a kid on Greg's soccer team, drops Greg into the puddle. Then Greg chases after Rowley, who's in a tree, for getting him into the whole mess in the first place. I was really surprised by this next part. Greg found out that he might be sent to Spag Union, and why I find that surprising is that I initially thought that Bishop Garrigan was Spag Union, but apparently they're just 2 separate things. There's a lot more of the ugly truths plot in here than I expected, with Rowley having a zit and Greg wondering when to get his growth spurt. You also have Greg unable to go to a party because he has to attend Uncle Gary's wedding, and there's multiple other stuff here. This really is just a full encapsulation of the original era of Wimpy Kid stories. There are many references to real products in this book, mainly because it was released online and didn't have the restrictions it would have when published. While at bingo with Grandma, Greg sees that both Piper and Ben are there. Greg tries to get information from Ben, who goes to the same school as Piper, but Ben just tells Greg embarrassing information about her, so Greg loses interest. We know this is the reason because when Greg goes to the roller skating rink from The Last Straw, Ben is there with Piper. Ben believes that Ben probably even lied about those stories just to throw Greg off. Remember in Cabin Fever, when Greg and Rowley argue over how volleyball is spelled? Yeah, that's how their fight from the end of the first book starts here. And this is actually the moment Greg and Rowley stop being friends. It also makes more sense that Greg calls Colin his backup friend here, since Colin actually appears in the book way more. The whole school is talking about how their fight got stopped before it really began, so Greg and Rowley are forced into a rematch. Before they can fight, Herbie Raymer, the bully I mentioned way earlier in the video, appears. So I guess he kind of acts more like the bullies from Halloween than the Mingo Kids, or maybe it's kind of a combination of the both. His friends grab Greg and Rowley because the outdoor basketball court is his turf after 3. And this is where we get the moment Rowley eats the cheese. And no one actually ever learns what happened to the cheese. You can tell by this point that the book is really starting to wrap up as we get to the conclusion of the Roderick storyline. When Roderick realizes that Greg based the Rory Screws Up story on him, he decides to reveal Greg's most embarrassing secret, and the rest plays out like in the Roderick Rules book. At the beginning of summer, Greg finds out why Frank was upset that he didn't turn in an envelope at school. It's because the envelope was for a field trip Frank could go to. This was the perfect excuse to miss the Sneelas, or the Smedleys as they're called in this book, baby's half birthday party. Instead of what happened in the original book, there's a moment that once again appears in Awesome Friendly Kid. Greg tries to grab the blanket Manny throws, but ends up falling and landing in a beehive where he gets stung multiple times. This gets Frank out performing at the party, and he rethinks sending Greg to Spag Union. The story ends on Wednesday, June 1st, with the ending of The Last Straw, where Greg and Rowley meet a girl who just moved into the neighborhood. And as Greg definitely is running low on paper by this point, the story comes to an end. I would 100% recommend this to any Diary of a Wimpy Kid fan. While the majority of the events in this book reappear in future Wimpy Kid installments, there's still some moments that have never been brought to the books, and even the moments that are reused have such a different feel to them due to everything happening across the span of just 1 year. Even without publishing a single book, you can tell that Jeff Kinney already perfectly understands this franchise and the characters that he has created. It's a very unique experience reading and going, hey, I remember that moment from the book. It's not just from here to there, it adapts this book, and from here to there, it adapts this other book. Everything melds together into one great and cohesive story. I see quite a few times this is called the more mature Wimpy Kid, but it definitely is not a major shift. It's definitely still something a kid can read. While I do love this version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, I am glad that this isn't the version we got. I don't think you can get a kid to read a nearly 1,300-page book, no matter how good it is. Plus, it would be a lot more difficult to have a Diary of a Wimpy Kid series if a huge chunk of the material for sequels was all in the first book. So I am grateful for the series we ended up receiving, but you can tell that Jeff Kinney was at the peak of creativity, being able to create so many jokes and story beats and managing to put it all together. If you're a Wimpy Kid fan, or if you're just someone who barely knows anything about the series, you should check this out, because this book perfectly shows what makes Diary of a Wimpy Kid so beloved and so special. That's gonna be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.